It's a different declaration, a major disaster declaration.
Millions of people without power, even more people without clean drinking water.
This is probably going to serve as a very timely reminder that they do need a more balanced system, a more balanced grid.
Texas goes dark. Why millions of people lost power and how to prevent it from ever happening again.
We can't just react to extreme weather events. We actually need to plan for them and prepare for them.
Big wind gets some of the blame, but the Vestas CEO says don't pinpoint renewables. Turbines do work in severe weather conditions.
We used to have turbines working the whole year long. In that energy transition, we will be playing a role in it, and a very important role of that transition.
Plus, teaming up to save the planet. Bill Gates tells us he plans to work more closely with Jeff Bezos.
We will end up doing some things in partnership, and at least we'll understand what the other one is up to.
I'm Anne-Marie Hodern, and this is Bloomberg Green. President Joe Biden declared a major disaster in Texas. It was a week of sub-zero temperatures, frozen oil and gas wells, and absolutely soaring electricity prices, all of which left millions in the dark. Bloomberg's Rachel Adams-Heard was one of those people. She's based in Houston and gives us a look at what it was like to live through the big freeze.
I'm in Houston. It's about 75 degrees and sunny. It honestly could not feel more different from what we experienced last week when we had this unprecedented winter storm move into the entire state of Texas and force millions of people to go without power for days. But we're really still dealing with the consequences of that disaster. Unfortunately, we've had dozens of deaths attributed to the cold and to the lack of electricity. Some of those were carbon monoxide poisoning, others were due to fires, and some were simply just because it was too cold and there was no way for them to keep warm. There's also a lot of people who've had pipes burst in their homes and who are struggling to fix that. Even as plumbers are in high demand. I passed by a plumbing supply store. The line was wrapped around the block. So a lot of people are trying to pick up the pieces of the last week. Clearly, there are going to be a lot of questions asked of state authorities. How did this happen? How are we going to make sure this doesn't happen again? Already, there are hearings planned. The state legislature, ERCOT, the grid operator, the Texas Public Utility Commission. We just have to remember as we come up with solutions how interconnected and how interdependent Texas's energy system is. This was a massive failing that spanned all the way from the oil and gas wells in the Permian Basin to the power plants themselves. We need to figure out what we're going to do in order to prevent this from happening when the next unusually cold event happens in Texas. And part of that equation is going to be when can we expect that to happen in the future? So I think it's 2 weeks for Texans, and there's going to be a lot of questions moving forward.
Brilliant reporting all week from Rachel Adams-Heard and her entire team in Texas. Now, as the situation begins to normalize, the question becomes, what was to blame and how do we prevent this from ever happening again? And to answer both those questions and more is our resident climate expert, Akshat Rathi. Akshat, let's first start out with the solution. How do we make sure that Texas, or anywhere else in America, frankly, never experience this sort of outage?
It's a tricky problem because, especially in Texas, and we should recognize that the cold snap affected the Midwest, but Texas experienced something that it hadn't experienced in the past decades. And it has a grid that is isolated almost from the rest of the American grid. And so what Texas now needs to build in its system is resilience, which will come from adding extra power capacity generation, extra energy storage capacity, and being able to interconnect with other parts of the grid so it can draw on power when needed.
Okay, so 3 solutions there. What would have made the biggest difference in this cold freeze?
We know that a number of power generating assets went down. So wind turbines froze, but that was only a minority of the problem. The majority of the problem came from natural gas power plants not being able to run. Either they weren't getting the gas that they needed, or there was some technical malfunction at the power plant. And so even if we added more power generation capacity in Texas and energy storage capacity in Texas, that particular week would not have had the solution it needed. And what it needed was more transmission cables connected with other neighboring states. And that's an example of what has been done already here in Europe. So the UK, for example, is connected to Belgium, Spain is connected to France, Sweden is connected to Denmark, and it allows for electricity to be moved across countries when needed, but also especially in the case of renewables, when there might not be enough wind in one part of Europe, it could be transported from another part through these transmission cables.
The big question, though, Akshat, is how much will this all cost?
That's going to be something that Texas and the regulators will have to work on, and there will be investigations and reports, and we can imagine the cost is going to be in the billions of dollars. But it is also not affordable to have this kind of week into a future which is going to face more and more extreme weather as the planet warms. And so it's a cost that Texans will have to bear, and hopefully it's not an unreasonable one.
Politically, you and I both know that wind turbines are really getting pinpointed and a lot of blame, but we do know that it's because they weren't built to withstand these types of temperatures. Is that something Texas can learn, say, from Europe?
It's possible, but we should recognize again, the number of times when Texas will face these kinds of low temperatures will still be, days in a year, if that. And so is it worth the cost of weatherizing and making sure that the wind turbines can operate at those low temperatures? That's a question that the regulators will have to study, and we'll have to do a cost-benefit analysis to decide whether it's worth it.
All right, thanks so much for joining us, Akshat Ratti, our resident climate expert here at Bloomberg News. Coming up, climate avengers assemble. Bill Gates says the world's 3 richest men may have to team up to prevent what he calls a climate disaster. Our interview next. This is Bloomberg Green.
We have left the stable and secure climatic period that gave birth to our civilizations. There is no going back. No matter what we do now, it's too late to avoid climate change. And the poorest and most vulnerable, those with the least security, are now certain to suffer. Perhaps the most significant lesson brought by these last 12 months has been that we are no longer separate nations, each best served by looking after its own needs and security. We are a single, truly global species whose greatest threats are shared and whose security must ultimately come from acting together in the interests of us all.
From Bloomberg's European headquarters in the city of London, I'm Amory Hodern, and this is Bloomberg Green. Now let's get your green brief with Jennifer Zabazaja.
Here's the climate news you need to know this week. The big freeze in Texas forced many wind turbines to stop operating. But researchers in Sweden have figured out how to keep the blades spinning, even through the harshest winter. In the Arctic Circle, they use systems to mitigate the ice and heat some of the equipment, meaning wind farms can stay online when the temperature drops as low as -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Of the 18,000 species of freshwater fish in the world, a new study warns nearly 25% are now at risk of extinction. Published in the journal Science, it says that in the 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, more than 86% of rivers around the world have either moderately or severely been affected by humans. Ford didn't sell a single fully electric car in Europe last year, but it's vowing to go almost completely electric by the end of the decade. It's plowing $1 billion into a new German factory as it overhauls its business across Europe. And for the first time, a tanker has sailed through Arctic sea ice in February. It's just the latest sign of how quickly climate change is accelerating, capping a year of extremely hot weather. The Arctic is warming more than twice as fast as the rest of the world. And that's your Green Brief. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in New York. Anne-Marie?
Captain America and Iron Man are no strangers to saving the world, but stopping the climate crisis may take its own set of superheroes. The Climate Avengers, we'll call them. And who better to take on that role than the three richest men on the planet? After the launch of his new book, How to Prevent Climate Disaster, Bill Gates says he wants to work more closely with Jeff Bezos and admires the work of Elon Musk as well. I guess you could call them the Avengers with a lot of cash.
Your carbon footprint will go down dramatically if you don't eat meat. But one way to do that is to be a customer some portion of the time of these new ways of making ground beef that people like Beyond and Impossible and others are bringing out. Because as demand for those goes up, they scale up their factories, they improve the quality, they get the price to come down. So whether it's an electric car or artificial burger, that demand is catalytic because we're trying to recreate what we saw with solar panels and lithium-ion batteries, where the volume actually brought the cost down. And for the passenger car, within 10 to 15 years, all these improvements will mean the green premium, the extra what you give up with an electric car where you might need a tax credit, that'll go all the way to zero. And the market, as you saw with GM's plans, will be green without the government having to impose regulations or tax credits. But those things are so key to help us get to that end state.
Now, we know you love burgers, and I'm just curious, like, what do you do when you get a craving? How often can you just not resist and you just eat a good old-fashioned burger?
Well, about 50% of the time when I have a burger, it's one that's made with these Impossible Foods or Beyond Meat ground beef. And those have essentially no greenhouse gas emissions. As they improve their products, and they're quite good, I really highly recommend that people try those. I'll get to the point where I'm 100% buying just those burgers. I'm also spending money on direct air capture and lots of things to completely offset my carbon footprint, which, it's very high because of the way I travel and, I have more than one house. So, I'm in a sense one of the most guilty, but I'm pioneering offset approaches that are really honest, and that as those get purchased, they'll also come down in price.
So you're planning to give meat up 100%?
The cow-based meat, now, some people are trying to change the cow's diet or capture the methane. So, I don't want to count the cow out. There's a lot of ingenuity there. But right now, these protein-based approaches have surprised me how far they've come in. When they've been offered in burger chains, the demand has been quite good.
Now, some of the critics have said you don't focus on the political obstacles enough when it comes to climate change. You're solely focusing on the technology here. If there's one thing that the Biden administration could do to help solve this problem faster, that would really make a difference, what would that one thing be?
Well, the long lead time item to drive innovation is R&D funded by the government. And in the health space, the US has done a brilliant job with the National Institute of Health that's driven breakthroughs and, creates private companies that take that and offer products to the US and to the world. The energy R&D budget is way too small, well below the health levels. So that's got to go up dramatically. Some of the tax credits to help the new product categories like green steel and cement or energy storage, we need to apply that tactic there. And then the government's a big purchaser, and they can buy more of these green products. And so we really need to get going and push the innovation and push the demand side for those innovations as well.
Now, we just saw a major shock to the electric grid in Texas, a lot of deaths. You mentioned that energy plants there should have been weatherized. And I'm curious, where do you think we should be making investments right now before this happens again?
Well, there's two things the Texas event shows and one thing it doesn't. It doesn't show that renewables were the problem in that case because there were shutdowns because of lack of weatherization in natural gas and even tripping one reactor to go off. But the two things it does show is that we're going to have more extreme events, so we need to be ready for that. And we need to invest in resilience. It is fair to say that if you don't build transmission and storage and some nuclear, which is not weather dependent, that you are going to have a lack of reliability when there's tough weather. And the politics of permitting transmission lines, we need to come up with a way to make that more attractive. So there's a legitimate issue of reliability, although it wasn't the problem in this case.
Coming up, the CEO of Vestas dispels the misconceptions around wind turbines in the winter. Plus, the future of turbines may be made out of wood. This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg's European headquarters in the city of London, I'm Emer Hodern, and this is Bloomberg Green.
What is our priority for keeping the lights on and the heat on?
Oil, gas, it's not going away anytime soon.
We really do need to have a very broad mix of power generating sources.
It really isn't about renewable energy versus fossil fuel energy.
Let's not try to pinpoint renewable. I think in that energy transition, we'll be playing a role in it.
Until we can reach the point that we have grid scale storage and battery technologies that allows us to rely on this energy 24/7, it's important that we not put ourselves in a situation where we're dependent upon it.
We need to make sure that we are smart enough to make those coexist and alongside one another, but while still keeping a focus on improving our environment.
This is a problem that has to be addressed, but it does not mean that we should step back now from what is our future. Our future is not in fossil fuels.
This is a timely reminder for a wake-up call, really, and saying that, yeah, we absolutely need fossil fuel in the mix. It's about how we get it greener.
Texans are usually more worried about the heat than the cold, but the state's deep freeze showed us that ice can pack just as much punch. With extreme conditions becoming a more regular occurrence across many parts of the world, what can our weather patterns tell us about the ever-changing climate? Well, we spoke to senior climate scientist Dr. Jennifer Francis to break down the factors at play and what we can learn from the Texas freeze.
What made this particular event so severe was that normal Arctic outbreak that we expect to get pretty much every winter was made colder, stronger, longer, deeper south because it was reinforced by a breakdown of the stratospheric polar vortex. The vortex on a typical winter doesn't really have any effect on our weather down here in the United States. But every so often, about every 2 years on average, something will disrupt the polar vortex. Wind exists because of temperature differences. Warm air expands. So if you were sitting on top of a layer of air that extended from, say, New York up to the Arctic and looking towards the North Pole, it would look like that layer of air was tilting downhill. And so just like water wanting to flow down the side of a mountain, that air starts to flow down that hill towards the Arctic. So that creates a south to north wind, but because the Earth is spinning, it turns that wind to the right. And so we end up with a west to east wind going around the northern hemisphere, and that is what we call the jet stream. When the jet stream becomes very wavy for whatever reason, and by wavy I mean taking these big northward swings and southward dips, that wave energy can travel upward and start poking the stratospheric polar vortex. You can think of the polar vortex as a spinning top, and if you start poking at a spinning top, eventually that top is going to fall off its spindle. In this particular case, it made it split. And when that happens, we know that that we're going to get some crazy weather. These breakdowns of the stratospheric vortex happen naturally, but there is more and more scientific evidence that these things are starting to happen more often, and we believe that there are some climate change connections. The jet stream, of course, is a very complicated thing. Many factors can cause it to be wavier. The fact that the Arctic is warming so much faster than anywhere else, about 3 times faster than the globe as a whole. Sea ice, for example, which is the ice floating on the Arctic Ocean, is now about 75% smaller in terms of volume than it was only 40 years ago. And the Arctic is a very important part of the Earth's climate system. You can think of it as the refrigerator of the Earth. We're as certain about the impacts of human activity on the warming of the globe as we are about having a ball in your hand, and when you let it go, we know it's going to fall to the ground. We have understood the physics behind those extra heat trapping or greenhouse gases in the atmosphere for over a century.
I really want to acknowledge just the immense human suffering that we saw.
The leaders and decision makers and utility companies in Texas need to listen to the science. Texas usually thinks more about their heat situation and having air conditioning, but as we've just seen, the cold is much more debilitating, especially if you also don't have electricity and you don't have water and the hospital's not working. It's going to take some money to be spent, and that's really true across the board when you start talking about climate change. Preparing for it in advance is going to cost much less money than dealing with the damage that comes later.
Now, in the wake of the electricity mayhem in Texas, we spoke with the world's largest wind turbine maker, Vestas, and we asked CEO Henrik Andersen about what needs to be done to prevent such a situation from happening again.
When you look at this, today out of the total energy generation in the world, only 1% comes from wind across the world. And out of the electricity generation in the world today, 7% comes from wind. And when you then go and drill into Texas as such, ERCOT was planning to have somewhere between 1.8 gigawatt and 7 gigawatt working from renewable energy throughout this online, which is a peak winter season. And we have had 4 gigawatt working throughout that period of time. So may I just highlight and probably also point a little bit here the listener to, we were founded out of the Nordics. We founded out of Denmark. We used to have turbines working the whole year long, and also under severely weather conditions, where we are used to test and run turbines all the way down to minus both 30 and 35 degrees. So I would just sort of say here, it is a matter of, let's not try to pinpoint renewable. I think in that energy transition, we will be playing a role in it, and a very important role of that transition.
And Henrik also told us about his company's investment in Modvion. Is the next generation of wind turbines going to be made from wood?
We are blessed with that when we put a turbine up, the turbine is basically carbon neutral after 4 months of its life, which means it will then, if it lives for 30 years, then it will be carbon negative for 29 and a half years after that.
That's it for this week's edition of Bloomberg Green, but keep the conversation going. Follow us at Climate on Twitter. I'm Amber Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green.